Welcome, and thank you for accepting this videoed version of my presentation for the Committee on the Present Danger of China, Washington, D.C., July 19th, 2019. I'm going to say hello to Steve and Brian and Frank, and thanks to everyone for listening. I'm here to talk to you about the strategic importance of Hong Kong, and not necessarily the geographical strategic importance, but very specifically the financial importance of Hong Kong as it relates to China and as it relates to both the U.S. and Great Britain. For those of you that are probably well aware due to the most recent media attention, Hong Kong has a number of MFN or free trade agreements with both Europe, Great Britain, and the U.S., and those agreements are governed by documents that were signed back in Great Britain's case in 1984 in the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 signed by Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping at the time. And in the U.S., our agreement is governed by the U.S.-Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992. Both of those agreements stipulate that Hong Kong must maintain its autonomy, even though we had this agreement, or Great Britain signed this agreement to hand Hong Kong back to the Chinese effectively in 1997. The Chinese agreed to a 50-year kind of hands-off policy from a perspective of the judiciary, the economy, as well as the legislative system. And so both of these agreements, again, governed by this idea of autonomy. So China's run this system with Hong Kong that's basically one country, two systems, i.e. It's a special administrative region of China. However, Hong Kong has been technically governing itself and has economic independence from China, as well as judicial independence and legislative independence. So what's been happening recently, and what has really transpired since February of this year, is the fact that China has pushed through Carrie Lam and her administration's government an extradition bill. The extradition bill is and was something that has been on the forefront of the 7.5 million people that live in Hong Kong. That bill basically makes it it skips the judicial oversight process of the Hong Kong judiciary and allows China to effectively deport anyone that China deems to be a criminal. And China's allegations or accusations of the criminality of a particular person, either traveling through or being a citizen of Hong Kong, that can then be sent to China without any kind of judicial process other than a rubber stamp from Hong Kong. Why is that important to us in the West? And the importance is vital to that of really China's lifeline. And China's lifeline is US dollars. And I'd like to go into just a brief overview of why it's so important to China. China runs two systems itself. It runs two currency systems, essentially, that of dollars and that of its own domestic currency, the renminbi or the yuan. And China, in its own economy, runs. They control the narrative. They control the printing press. They control just about everything. The police, and they control how their economy runs internally, and they can, again, print as much money as they need to. What China's real problem is, as they interface with the rest of the world, nobody will accept RMB as payment for any of the goods that China wants to transact, either goods or services internationally. And so China's FX reserve pile is that made mostly of dollars, euros, yen, and pounds, or let's call it global currencies. But really, for all intents and purposes, let's say it's dollars. And that FX reserve pile is what China uses, again, to interface with the world. China is desperately short natural resources. They're short food. They're desperately short energy. They're short all kinds of things, base metals, that it takes to generate the GDP that China generates internally. And so it must have an ever-growing pile of dollars if it's going to have an ever-growing GDP. And so where the syntax comes in is the fact that China's dollar pile has been depreciating. And it's been being sucked out because they run huge twin deficits now. Well, they run a deficit, fiscal deficit of north of 10% of its GDP, one of the largest in the world. And now they're starting to run a current account deficit on an ongoing basis going forward. We believe, I believe that you're going to see a persistent current account deficit from now on an annualized basis in China. And what that means is their dollar pile will continue to shrink. So they must source capital from the rest of the world, from somewhere, from someone. The MSCI inclusion for their equity and bond indices is a much needed infusion of capital into China. But one of the other avenues of capital, and where the Chinese, the wealthy Chinese, hide a lot of their assets, is in Hong Kong. And this Hong Kong capital flow, really from south to north, is vitally important to Chinese companies, as seen forth in Alibaba's proposed secondary listing of a $20 billion deal that is really right around the corner. More importantly, they raise roughly $40 billion a year. So far, they've raised about half of that in about 200 deals in Hong Kong. It is the place in which China Inc. raises dollars. They raise both equity and debt dollars. So with China's overreach and with their breaching of the agreement, which China does with just about every agreement they sign, they're breaching the 1984 Joint Declaration with the British, and they're breaching the 1992 Hong Kong-U.S. Policy Act by essentially overreaching with their in the judiciary. And why that's so important to us as a country, again, is China has that, or Hong Kong has that special trade status where they're not burdened by any of the tariffs that the U.S. is imposing on China, and they have a free trade agreement with the UK. The mechanics of that deal are very important to understand today, and the mechanics are so that you have the British have a twice a year a review of the sufficient autonomy of Hong Kong, and that goes, those reviews are delivered to Parliament twice a year. In the US, it's a once a year review that the State Department sends to POTUS. And POTUS, in his sole authority as per the agreement, decides whether or not Hong Kong is, quote, sufficiently autonomous to maintain its MFN or its trade agreement with the US. So what you've seen recently is with China's overreach in pushing through the extradition bill, you saw bipartisan support to try to preempt the president and basically take this decision out of his hands. You saw Nancy Pelosi, Marco Rubio, Menendez, and you saw a number of the people on both sides of the aisle in the U.S., which, when was the last time we saw Pelosi and Rubio work together on something? They immediately convened together and launched potential legislation to preempt President Trump and take that decision out of his hands and decide that Congress, in its sole right, might determine whether or not Hong Kong is sufficiently autonomous. Now, that is vitally important to understanding. If we remove that designation from Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is burdened by the tariffs that China is burdened by, and essentially we start treating Hong Kong as China, it's so important for Hong Kong because Hong Kong's trade represents more than 350% of its GDP, and it runs a very small surplus today. It is vitally important to Hong Kong to maintain that MFN status and also not to be treated as China. And so what I urge everyone in the room to think about is whether or not today is Hong Kong sufficiently autonomous? Does it run its own judiciary, its own legislature, and does it run its own economy? Many people would think, including myself, that they're not sufficiently autonomous the way it stands today. China's Supreme Court is the court of the land in Hong Kong. Mutual legal participation between Hong Kong and China is basically run by China. The CEO of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, is chosen by China. So what is likely to happen going forward is I think it's, again, vitally important for the U.S. and our lawmakers and our State Department and POTUS to realize that Hong Kong isn't sufficiently autonomous. Hong Kong is in real trouble. In 2047, or whether that should be discounted back to the next year or two, we're going to see China probably remove Carrie Lam and install a pro-Beijing hardliner and push this extradition bill through. Even though they said it's dead, they have legally not withdrawn this potential legislation, i.e. that means they only have they have a 12-day window from when they could revive the legislation, put it to a vote, and get the pro-Beijingers to vote this through. Hong Kong is at the crossroads today of the capital flow into China. We have to stop the capital flow into China if we as a country want to start to win the economic war with China. I think that's something that Frank, something that everyone there, Frank, Steve, and all of you understand. We are fighting 4 wars with China. We're fighting, we're not fighting a kinetic war, but we are fighting an economic war, a cyber war, and an information narrative war. I think it's very important for us to fight the war with China by getting the upper hand on their economy, and as they exercise their communistic control over what used to be a free and democratic country is of vital importance to the U.S. National security. And I think it's important for us to pay particular attention to that and support members of Congress in both the Senate and the House to maybe take that decision out of the president's hands and put it in Congress's hands in case this incredible overreach by China continues. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to our next Committee on the Present Danger meeting in the future.